Hey, everybody. So the question arises from a number of you. What is my opinion of Ayn Rand now that I've converted to Christianity? Has it been modified at all, et cetera, et cetera? And that's a very good and fair question because Ayn Rand was definitely a staple of my worldview when I was an atheist. And so definitely want to get into that and address that where I do and don't agree with her now and that sort of thing. I'm going to cordially request that we not get two topics that we not get into in the comments section. One is Ayn Rand's rather unfortunate comments about Native Americans. Indeed, she was no fan of them, and she was very unsympathetic to what they went through. That said, I think that her writings on the subject of racism, from a philosophical standpoint, which condemn racism on no uncertain terms, are far more relevant to her actual philosophical system and to her actual worldview. So I don't think that it's necessary to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I think that her writing on racism and her writings condemning racism are some of the best writings on the subject ever put to paper. So I just value those a lot more strongly than some admittedly badly chosen positions to take about the conflict between Native Americans and the invading white man and that sort of thing. The second thing I don't want to get into is there's this rumor that anti-Ayn Rand people love to dredge up and love to bring out. And it's one of those things where it's, a lie gets around the world, gets halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its pants. But it's the idea that Ayn Rand collected Social Security. So there's two things to say about this. One, the rumor has never actually been substantiated. It stems from the discovery that in the time period towards the end of Ayn Rand's life, which would have been the late 70s and early 80s, there was a woman in New York, living in New York City, named Anne O'Connor, who was collecting Social Security, and people have extrapolated from that it was Ayn Rand. That has never been proven, and the basis for it is that Ayn Rand's husband was named Frank O'Connor. However, her first name was never Ann, A-N-N. It was Ayn, A-Y-N. So, anyway, that said, even if it had been substantiated that it was her, it would not be a contradiction of her worldview. She has an excellent essay. I believe it's in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. It might be in the Ayn Rand lexicon, but it's on the subject of government grants. And in that, she addresses people, objectivists, laissez-faire capitalists, that sort of thing, using government grants, using public schools, collecting Social Security, things like that. And she says that that's actually not using those services is not outside her worldview, on the basis that you have the right to use the services that your tax dollars are paying for, even if those tax dollars were taken from you against your will. What she's, from a moral standpoint, what she says is that it comes with a strong asterisk, and that is that one, you yourself are not advocating for the expansion of those programs, and two, you are in favor of drawing down. You are ultimately in favor of drawing down those programs and replacing them with private sector alternatives. So whether you agree with that or not, that is her worldview, and collecting Social Security would not have been outside the acceptable bounds of her ideas. Anyway, so on the subject of Ayn Rand, how my position has changed on Ayn Rand, the first thing to say is I will always enjoy her stories at the level of fiction. The Fountainhead is this amazing and inspiring story about a man staying true to his artistic vision against all odds. That's an absolutely beautiful story. Among the Living, not Among the Living, We the Living, not one of her best works, but certainly a very captivating depiction of growing up and entering adulthood in communist Russia and that sort of thing. And then Anthem is I think, a phenomenal piece for anybody that believes in the spirit and the triumph of the individual. And that's, again, that one is also not, you don't have to agree with her on economics to appreciate that one. And then Atlas Shrugged, my God, it's a beautifully written story, amazing story. And come on, it's the novel that inspired BioShock. Of course, it's always going to be amazing, at least to me. I love this. I love the Art Deco future world of that story, and the characters are great. People say her characters are wooden. I wholly disagree. I love her characters, and I love her character development, and I love her prose, her descriptive writing. I think a lot of people say her writing is very stiff and wooden, and I think part of that's just because it comes from, she's writing from such a bygone era. She's very much influenced by people like Victor Hugo and that sort of thing. So anyway, so there's that. I will always appreciate that. But the real question is, well, she was an atheist, and now that and that atheism, that rejection of God and of spirituality, heavily informed her worldview and her writing. So where do I stand with that, and how do I reconcile that in light of my Christian conversion? Well, first of all, obviously Ayn Rand would not have approved, and that's that. I don't live my life based on whether or not Ayn Rand would have approved of it. And I would even argue that that's a critical part of her philosophy. A critical part of her philosophy. She would argue that objectivism teaches you how to think; it does not teach you what to think, and that's a direct quote. Anyway, so let's look for a minute at what she's actually accomplishing, and how in her writing, in taking on an atheistic worldview in her writing, and how that relates. And there's a few specific points that I think will get at a limited perspective on her part, irrespective of whether or not you, the viewer, believe in God. And to understand, she began from Ayn Rand grew up in communist Russia, escaped communism, and came to the United States. And her worldview and her philosophy was based on literally the mindset of, how do we do everything 180 degrees opposite from how they were doing things in communist Russia? What philosophy, what worldview do we have to take on to avoid having that happen? And something that she was confronted about a lot was people saying, well, over in communist Russia, they're atheistic. They're taking on your worldview. And she pointed out correctly that communist Russia was not atheistic. Communist Russia did have a religion and a form of worship, which was state worship. It was using the edifice of religion, the edifice of the state, to replace the edifice of God. And so, what she ultimately rejected was the collectivizing and assimilating element of religion that causes people to subjugate their individual intellect and their individual identity in favor of the collective interests of the whole. And so that begins her rejection of atheism. Now, there were people that were not atheists that she respected and appreciated and that sort of thing. That was not necessarily a breaking point with anybody in terms of how she respected people in her personal life. But getting into the actual atheistic spiritual arguments that are made in her writing, they are made most stridently in Atlas Shrugged, especially in John Galt's speech. Originally, she was going to have a character in Atlas Shrugged that was going to be James Taggart's priest. And the idea would be that James Taggart would become so depraved and so vile of a person that his priest would refuse to forgive him of his sins, and that would be the priest's way of going on strike. And so she wrestled, I should say, back and forth with whether or not to include that character. And it's interesting because she ultimately decided not to put the character in because she did not want to have a sympathetic portrayal of the edifice of religion. And so it's interesting in Atlas Shrugged because by removing that character, the book itself does not really become atheistic until John Galt gives his speech. All of the other arguments presented in favor of collectivism that are torn down dramatically throughout the course of events in the story are all largely secular arguments. And so the priest character was going to represent the spiritual component of that. And again, she took it out because she did not want a sympathetic portrayal of the edifice of religion. So John Galt's speech is where the secular or the atheistic answers to spiritually collectivist arguments come into play. And in the John Galt speech, she makes a number, in the John Galt speech, she lays out objectivism. If you only read the John Galt speech from Atlas Shrugged, you can know everything about objectivism, and she wrote it that way intentionally. So I believe it's for the book For the New Intellectual just has the John Galt speech as one chapter, and she says in there, "This is the complete summary of my worldview." So the John Galt speech, spoiler alert if you've not read the book, but the John Galt speech comes at a point towards the end of the novel where throughout the course of Atlas Shrugged, the brilliant inventors and business people and all of that, all of the movers and shakers of the world have been strangely and mysteriously disappearing for some unknown reason. It's ultimately revealed that these people have been meeting John Galt, who is the anthropomorphic embodiment of Ayn Rand's philosophy, or the human embodiment, I should say, of Ayn Rand's philosophy. When they meet John Galt, they realize that they have been serving the needs of the collective unnecessarily and decide to leave the collective to its own devices and go live off in the mountains under a holographic force field where no one can find them. And so towards the end of the novel, the world is finally actively collapsing into ruin because no one knows how to do anything anymore. And the president, Mr. Thompson, is about to take to the airwaves, the televisions and the radios, etc., to speak to the world about, or speak to the country about the world crisis. And he's interrupted by John Galt, who hijacks the signal and delivers this epic speech that in the book, I believe they say it runs 3.5 hours, and it takes about that long to read it aloud. John Galt delivers this epic speech explaining every aspect of collectivism that has brought down the world. And he speaks specifically to religion at several points. And so we start to get into Ayn Rand's perspective on God. And what she's doing, John Galt begins by saying that the moral good of all people is rooted in the statement A is a thing is itself, that reality is final. And anytime we erect a psychological barrier between ourselves and the nature of reality, we are doing something that is not just wrong, but actively evil, because it's in denying the objective nature of reality that we allow ourselves to do things that are evil. We, as he puts it, we turn off our mind and erect a fog between ourselves and reality. And so from that we extrapolate that collectivism is inherently evil, because when we prioritize the good of society, we are prioritizing the good of an abstract concept, an immaterial, non-existent abstract concept, over the good of the individual. And the reason for that is that a society is only a collection of individuals. And I still agree with that. I still agree that you cannot rationally prioritize the collective good over the individual good. So, society being an abstract, immaterial, abstract concept that is ultimately only a collection of individuals, we cannot say that we are serving the moral good by serving the interest of society. We can only say we are serving the moral good by serving the interest of the individual. And that I still fundamentally agree with. To give you an idea of why I still fundamentally agree with it, look at, for example, in North Korea, where if, we talk about that, God knows the penal system and the judicial system in this country, in the United States, have a lot of problems, and I'm not claiming they're perfect at all. But there's one thing that we don't stop to think about, and that is that if you are convicted of a crime, only you will serve the punishment for that crime. Only the person actually convicted of the crime will serve the punishment for it. Whereas in North Korea, if you're convicted of a crime and you commit suicide to get out of the service of the penalty, for example, being sent to a labor colony or something like that, or you die before your punishment is completed, that sort of thing, your penalty or your punishment can then be, the remainder of your punishment can then be assigned to your family up to 3 generations. And and that's to discourage people from committing suicide to escape their torment in the labor colonies and that sort of thing. And that right there shows you why the individual, the good of the individual is morally superior to the good of the collective, because the collective always, the collective interest, the people concerned with the collective interest know how to manipulate and target the good of the individual to motivate the individual to do what they want. They motivate the individual to get in line by targeting the people, their family, the people that the individual themselves cares about personally, not the abstract concept that is society at large. So that's an example of where I fundamentally agree with that. Now, Ayn Rand then carries that notion of inherent evil, takes the notion of the individual creating a philosophical smokescreen that allows them to serve the interest of an abstract concept rather than acknowledging the concrete reality of society. The concrete reality of the world, of objective reality. She takes that and applies it to God and applies it to religion. And so, again, you have to, there is a necessary distinction that has to be drawn between the nature of God and the nature of religion, the nature of the edifices that exist for the purpose of serving God, that we can decline to serve those edifices and not necessarily be declining to serve God and serve the interests of God. So I am not, now as I get into this, I am not here trying to make an argument for the existence of God necessarily. I'm not trying to present some watertight proof that God exists. I don't think one does, because, if we could prove God definitively that God existed, faith would not be a component of it. So, with Ayn Rand's view on God, on spirituality, in the John Galt speech, he critically at one point says that he's talking about how the collective interests of society continually insist that the individual accept non-answers as factual answers, accept that A is not A in an Orwellian context. And he says, God, they tell you, is that which no man can know, and then demand that you call it knowledge. Or God, they say, is that which no body can know, and then demand that you call it knowledge. That right there is a fundamental mischaracterization of at least the Christian worldview, which absolutely would argue that you can know God and that you can have a personal relationship with God. They would argue that the nature of that relationship is going to take place on different terms, that God is not going to be interacting with you objectively and directly and communicating with you that way, but that it's possible to that by studying the Word of God, embodying the will of God, you start to live with in a greater harmony with the universe, in a greater harmony with the world around you. You have a greater sense of internal peace and that sort of thing, and that harmony, that sense of harmony and balance constitutes a knowledge of and a personal relationship with God. And you can extrapolate further from that. Carl Jung was great about exploring the balance point between, or the confluence rather, between religion or between spirituality and psychology. And you can further extrapolate from that it's necessary to while God is ultimately something that exists above and beyond the full capacity of human knowledge, it is beneficial to contextualize God in an anthropomorphized form by understanding him as a man, as a human being, and as a human entity, if you will, by calling God him and addressing him as as our Father and that sort of thing, putting our relationship to him in a human context, in a humanized familial context, allows us to better appreciate that relationship. So I would argue that is a fairly straw man point. It's people are not literally saying God is something you can't know and they demand you call it knowledge. They are just presenting that knowledge in a way that Ayn Rand herself does not agree with. So what it ultimately comes, bringing it back around to her worldview, her idea that the moral good is rooted in the concept of non-contradiction. She says that, to quote the John Galt speech, that a leaf cannot be a stone at the same time. It cannot be all red and all green at the same time. A is A. And this is something that actually C.S. Lewis addressed really well in his writing, where he talked about how people will ask questions like, can God create a four-sided triangle? Can God create a pit so wide he himself cannot jump across it? The idea being that if God is omnipotent, can God then enact a state of reality that has no potential to occur? And to that I would actually say no, because the word omnipotent means that God is in command of all that has the potential to occur. A four-sided triangle has no potential to occur, so God is not in command of it. C.S. Lewis summarized it perfectly by saying that no, God cannot create a four-sided triangle, not because God is incapable of it, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when it is applied to God. And so I think that is, that right there. So she's arguing that a spiritual worldview would be telling you that a stone can be painted all red and all green at the same time, that it's the embrace of a contradiction. I think that she's confusing something there, which is the embrace of a contradiction versus the embrace of a paradox, and being at peace with a paradox. And this is where it's important to bring in the writing of G.K. Chesterton. So G.K. Chesterton is one of the great Christian writers of Christian apologetics of all time. Long before that expression, Christian apologetics, became a dirty word associated with creationist charlatans like Kent Hovind and that kind of thing. But G.K. Chesterton, along with C.S. Lewis, along with George MacDonald and a number of other writers from the early part of the 20th century, created a really great body of knowledge of philosophical arguments about God, philosophical arguments for the existence of God and in favor of God and of a spiritual worldview and that sort of thing, specifically a Christian worldview. G.K. Chesterton has 3 books. He wrote many books. He was very prolific in fiction and nonfiction, and that was one of the many ways he was an influence on C.S. Lewis. But G.K. Chesterton has 3 specific books, Heretics, Orthodoxy, and The Everlasting Man, that outline in detail his worldview and his belief system. And in Orthodoxy, he talks about paradoxes extensively. And so a paradox is different from a contradiction. To summarize G.K. Chesterton's worldview, a paradox is different from a contradiction in the sense that a contradiction is a contradiction is when 2 concepts clash with one another and only one of them can emerge correct. And that comes back to the a rock cannot be all red and all green at the same time. It has to be one or the other, you know. And so that to say that it could be would be a contradiction. That would be a contradictory statement. That is 2 unreconcilable absolutes pitted against each other. A paradox, on the other hand, is different because a paradox is something that seems to defy the course of our intuition and defy our intuition and defy our rational capacity, but still prove to be true. And in Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton talks about, or there's a chapter in Orthodoxy that's arguably easily the most famous, talked about, celebrated chapter in the book Orthodoxy, and that is the book the chapter The Ethics of Elfland. And so Chesterton begins Orthodoxy by talking about how it is it is necessary and proper to our psychology to have a psychological system which allows a psychological functionality that allows us to reconcile paradoxes. And he argues from the beginning of the book that what happens is you have characters, or you have people who rely entirely on their logic and their rational capacity, and that is ultimately what drives people mad. That's what drives people crazy. And he points out, correctly, for example, that chess players famously, and, you can see this even in the modern era with people like Bobby Fischer, a lot of famous chess players have had severe mental health issues and that sort of thing. And he points out that it's not spirituality or abstract concepts that cause people to go crazy. It's or I should say, cause people to have a mental breakdown. It's trying to apply a series of rational constructs to a degree to which they can no longer apply, and having the existential crisis, and that the mental breakdown comes from the existential crisis of realizing that you've reached the apex, the nadir of your rational faculty, and cannot and still have not accounted for all of the things that are troubling you, all of the things that are giving you problems, that there's a point at which rationality ceases to be fulfilling as an answer to the contradictions in your mind. And it's at this point that we have to embrace and start to study and understand paradoxes. And so and this is why the chapter on the ethics of Elfland is the most important chapter, because Chesterton talks about how in that chapter how he learned so much about the functional nature of reality from fairy tales, that reading stories about fantastical magical creatures and that sort of thing gave him so much knowledge about how the world functioned and about how existence functioned and that sort of thing, because it allowed him to reconcile paradoxes in his mind. And he talks about, for example, some of the famous fairy tales, what he's referring to as Elfland, some of the famous fairy tales from his childhood, things like James the Giant Killer, where the paradox is that that feeling fear and being consumed by fear is a necessary part of being courageous. That or the story of Beauty and the Beast, where a thing must be loved before it becomes lovable. And that these things seem like paradoxes. Now, let's use that last one, for example, that, well, let's use both of those in light of Ayn Rand's worldview. Ayn Rand's worldview would hold that that your senses are a thing, that your senses are a thing that gives you information about the nature of reality, that your emotions are your natural recognition of your sensory information, and that it is immoral to be ruled by your emotions, because your emotions are only giving you abstract reactions to the nature of reality outside of you that have to be consciously integrated by your rational faculty. Well, this doesn't really jibe with what we know about how the human mind works, and the what's the innovations that have been made in the realm of psychology and that sort of thing. Her concept was that if you can rationally account for something, then the negativity that you're associating with it will dissipate, will thereby dissipate. And that's not necessarily the case. We have the subconscious mind. The mind reacts to things on a visceral level. The functioning of the mind is very much the outgrowth of the nervous system that's trained over time. Like the book, The Body Keeps the Score, where trauma remains, even if we rationally understand, even if we've rationally worked out a rational understanding of something that was traumatizing for us, the visceral effect of that trauma remains. So her rationalizing, her sanity by way of rationalization worldview really doesn't work very well in that regard. It's really not going to help you out very much. And there's a great movie about Ayn Rand, the latter period of Ayn Rand's life, called The Passion of Ein Rand, and it focuses specifically on the relationship that she had with Barbara and Nathaniel Brandon, who were two of her proteges, and they were a married couple, two of her proteges, and she and Nathaniel Brandon had an affair. And when they went to their respective spouses with the news that they wanted to have this affair, and their argument was, well, we are all enlightened intellectual people. We understand we all have this rational basis for why we love one another and why we care for one another, and we understand that what we want to do here with this affair is an outgrowth of our rational faculty. Therefore, we can enjoy it, and you, as our spouses, shouldn't have to feel any negativity or any negative emotion about it, because this, that, or the other. And ultimately, their spouses were deeply hurt by it, and were ultimately deeply hurt by it, and felt deeply betrayed by it. And what the film goes to, and granted, it takes, as many biopics do, it does take a certain amount of historical liberty with the actual event, or a certain amount of dramatic liberty with the actual events. But in the movie, what ultimately happens is Nathaniel Brandon breaks off the relationship with Ayn Rand in favor of a relationship, an affair with a younger, more attractive woman that is not his intellectual equal, is not his intellectual equal, not ambitious to conquer the world like he was, and that sort of thing. Not Ayn Rand's concept of a Randian hero on the literary level or anything like that. And he started having this relationship with her, and Ayn Rand was in the movie, and to a large extent in real life as well, unable to accept that Nathaniel Brandon would be attracted to this woman that on what she thought was a fundamentally irrational basis. And so it's what Chesterton presents, getting back to the ethics of Elfland, what Chesterton presents is that there is a paradoxical component to our nature that's always going to be there, a component of our nature that's always going to defy the logical and rational dictates of our ability to interact with reality. And so he argues that the spiritual worldview is ultimately what allows us to reconcile the rationalistic objective worldview with the fundamentally irrational functioning of our lower psyche, of our base psyche, what we would now think of as the subconscious and that sort of thing. And he proceeds then throughout the rest of the book to present the argument that the Christian worldview is the worldview which best addresses and encapsulates the nature of the paradoxical nature of our relationship to reality and our relationship to ourselves. And so I feel like his writing, more than anything, really fills in that gap that gap between Ayn Rand's worldview and the realm of spirituality. It was a gap that she never wanted to fill in. It was a gap that she never wanted to reconcile. And so that is what I would, that is what my ultimate answer would be, is that the writings of G.K. Chesterton and then, the people that followed him like C.S. Lewis and that sort of thing, fill in an intellectual and philosophical gap for me where the system of Ayn Rand left off. And so that's the ultimate reconciliation of the ideas there. But, again, my disagreement with her about the nature of God is one of the less significant disagreements, I would say, that I now have with her. She would argue that you cannot rationally justify acting for the betterment of other people unless you specifically value those people that you are helping in a manner that is personally and directly beneficial to you. So for example, her husband, Frank O'Connor, was a struggling actor who eventually became a painter. Not a lot of money in those professions, but she cared about him, and because she cared about him and his happiness, his happiness would beget her happiness, she had no problem with supporting him financially when she had to. So fair enough. But she would argue against the idea that there is a reasonable and rational degree to which we serve our fellow man and serve other people. She would say that just doing that in and of itself is fundamentally irrational, and that and would argue that even if you don't do it with direct benefit to yourself, you still get a sense of satisfaction from it, and therefore you are not behaving altruistically. Well, I would agree with that on its face, but what I would disagree with is the idea that there is not a rational benefit to the individual in serving going out of their way to serve the needs of other people. And that is that what I've discovered in my life is that helping other people, serving other people in a supportive context, in a supportive way, and that sort of thing, is very beneficial and rationally beneficial to me in a very important way to my own psyche, namely that it gets me out of my own head. If I concern myself with the problems of other people, I am not sitting there stewing and dwelling in my own problems and my own concerns and getting stuck on myself. And paradoxically, doing that, giving out to the world with that positive energy, often has the effect of addressing the needs and the issues that are affecting me, that people actually do appreciate your giving. If you have a giving nature, many people actually do appreciate that and internalize it in a totally proactive way, and they want to give back to you. They want to help. They do want to. They do want to benefit you. Ayn Rand would argue then, of course, that you are ultimately working for mutual gain on both sides. That's not what's going on there. Again, it is paradoxical. That you give of yourself and other people. You give to people of yourself, wanting and expecting nothing in return, and other people in turn give to you expecting and wanting nothing in return. And there is, and paradoxically, our lives do function well that way. We function well that way because we get out of our own heads. We stop stewing in our own problems, and we work for the betterment of other people for a change, and that does better us. That does help us function better. So there's a paradox there, but it's not a contradiction. And that's very important to understand. Now that said, of course, that does not mean that I'm suddenly in favor of all sorts of ridiculous government spending programs and everything. There's, as Reagan put it, there's nothing, Ronald Reagan said there's nothing scarier than someone who says I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And so, no, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily in favor of huge government spending programs, or that I'm teetering precariously on the brink of becoming a communist or something like that. Again, Ayn Rand's worldview is pathologically rooted in the idea of how do we do everything 180 degrees the opposite of what they were doing in Soviet Russia, in communist Russia. And she has some very, very profound walls built up, and in regards to structuring our lives around the proactive and positive service to others and that sort of thing. And so that is where spirituality in its capacity to reconcile paradoxes fills in that gap, and allows me to function in that capacity, working, in different ways, working to benefit other people. Working to benefit other people, where, if I have to help a customer at my day job, after I've already clocked out for the day, that kind of thing, it does not feel like it does not feel burdensome to me, that sort of thing. Granted, if I end up helping that person for any significant period of time, I'm going to be able to clock that time anyway. I mean, it's not a totally lost cause. But like if I'm on my way out the door and I've already clocked out and I'm on my way out the door and a customer needs help, it doesn't feel like, I can help that person and then walk out the door not thinking, God, why did that guy waste my time? Couldn't he see I was already heading out the door? No, that aspect of it, that is what is more, to me, that getting that component of the Ayn Rand worldview out of my system was more important than my disagreement with her about the nature of the existence of God. And and then so we see kind of where that's going there, and ultimately that's important because as someone who's neurodiverse and someone who's on the autism spectrum, something I have a real hard time with is black and white thinking, and this is probably the most significant and important part of it. Of my personal evolution in this regard. Black and white thinking is a huge stumbling block for me, and Ayn Rand's worldview, as you can tell, is very much rooted in black and white thinking. You are either right or wrong, and she's not wrong to point out that there are times when morality is objectively in a state of black or white. In the John Galt speech, he says, is a man's wound to be disinfected to save his life, right or wrong? So there are times when we can make absolute distinctions about the nature of right and wrong and that sort of thing, and those are important distinctions to understand. But trying to apply those philosophical absolutes to the infinite degree of variations in human nature is much, much more difficult. There are all of these trends, all of these sayings throughout history, never trust a man who does blank on blank, or that kind of thing, that you can draw these absolute ideas about. You can never trust this type of person in this type of context, that sort of thing. And Ayn Rand's worldview is full of those kind of ideas and those kinds of perspectives. And being somebody that is autistic, I struggle with black and white thinking, and struggle with acknowledging degrees of diversity between what I perceive as black and white concepts, I almost have to take the existence of those degrees on faith, entirely on faith. There's a line from the Sean Connery Nicolas Cage movie The Rock, where Sean Connery's character says losers whine about doing their best, winners go home and fuck the prom queen. And that was a worldview and an attitude that I naturally agreed with and embraced for a great deal of my life, and it still seems logically correct to me. I've always had that attitude of second place is first loser, that kind of thing. And the problem is that worldview has created a lot of negativity and a lot of difficulty in my life that shouldn't be there. A lot of difficulty where I've accomplished something and people say, wow, you really accomplished something. And I'm like, yeah, so what? There are degrees of accomplishment higher than what I've done, so why should I care about this? And that sort of thing. And Ayn Rand's worldview encourages that kind of thinking. And when you start applying that kind of thinking to your approximation of people, you find yourself alienating a lot of good people and embracing a lot of morally dubious people who know how to say the right things. And there's a great commentary or a great section of a Patton Oswalt stand-up comedy routine where he says, okay, think about it this way. Tell me between these two people, which one of these people is the morally decent person? Which one of these people is your friend? Okay, here's person number one. Well, while I think that we do have a definite plurality of sexual expressions and gender identities, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, etc., I do think that a heteronormative worldview is preferable, at least for the propagation of the species. Okay, that's guy number one. Guy number two says, if a couple of fags want to get married, hey, that's their business, man. No problem here. Just hope whatever makes them happy. Some dude wants to cut his dick off, call himself a chick, hey, you got to share the planet with these people, It's not my business, whatever's good for them, Okay. Guy number one was saying all of the right things, but he was saying them to an undesirable end, at least if you're a gay, lesbian, LGBT activist, that sort of thing, which is the context Patton Oswalt was saying it. He's saying all of the right things, but he's saying them towards a duplicitous end, whereas the other guy is saying all of the wrong things, but his actual worldview is a worldview of tolerance and patience and compassion and that sort of thing. So that is what applying Ayn Rand's worldview to the real world did to me that I regret, is that it caused me to alienate a lot of people where I was thinking, well, this person is logically and fundamentally wrong about this idea. They're saying the wrong things. They're saying something illogical. Therefore, they voided their basis as a decent human being, and I reject them and view them as the evil that they are. And I embrace this person that's saying all of the right things. And very often, again, talking about the paradox, resolving the paradoxes, as G.K. Chesterton observes, very often, paradoxically, the evilest people in the world are the people who say all of the right things, who appear to be saying all of the right things. That's embodied in how Lucifer, Satan, in the Christian tradition, is the most beautiful angel, the most pleasing, beautiful angel of all of God's angels. He's the absolute, the evil. He's evil, but everything appears to be perfect in accordance with a rational concept of perfection and that sort of thing. And yet everything is ultimately serving an evil end. And so that is where that's the part of Ayn Rand's worldview that I most completely reject now. There can be people can be living. I do believe in as much as possible an open market free market economic concept, people can be in favor of that and still be completely evil. People can be in favor of economic models I don't agree with, like communism and socialism, and still be fundamentally good people in their own lives and in and of themselves. And if we try to apply the rationality with which we approach philosophical abstractions to the abstract nature, the abstract and infinitely variant nature of human beings, then eventually things go to shit. Eventually things fall apart. And that's where Chesterton talks about people kind of overdosing on logic and overdosing on rationality, and that being the basis for their downfalls. And so that's the part where I have to step back from Ayn Rand, because that is where she did not intentionally mean for it to be. She didn't mean for it to be this way, but that is where her thinking embraces a form of religiosity. And I think that the fact that in all of these so-called atheistic philosophies, we find ourselves inevitably coming back to a set of philosophical absolutes, of axiomatic philosophical principles, which force us to embrace a relegated thinking concept of thinking. I think it kind of points to the fact that we have this nature within us that requires that we relegate ourselves to something. You know, Chesterton said you have an open mind so that you can or the purpose of having an open mind is so that you can close it around something. And so, we have this component in our nature that requires something that can resolve these paradoxes for us. And I agree with Chesterton that the Christian worldview most effectively resolves those paradoxes. And in the book Orthodoxy, he goes through these paradoxes that are resolved by Christianity, with the ultimate paradox being the crucifixion. How does the death of one man atone for the sins of all the world? The atonement actually, or the effect of it actually comes with the embracing of the paradox, because that allows us to proceed forward from a basis of love and compassion and kindness that we otherwise would not be able to experience or embrace. Orthodoxy is an absolutely fascinating, fabulous book. All of his writing is great, and it's full of wonderful humor and wonderful humor and insight and good cheer throughout. And that's one of the things that I like about Chesterton is you really do feel like you are you're reading the writing not of somebody that's consumed by the sins of the world and the fallen nature of man, but rather somebody that's very at peace with the world and finds a great deal of gentle, good humor in it, and that sort of thing. So anyway, I think hopefully that answers the question. If there's anything unresolved in your mind, feel free to ask me about it, or just embrace the paradoxes.